Hi, this is Bob Harrington from Stanford University. I'm joined here on Medscape Cardiology with my friend and colleague from Harvard Medical School and the Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital, Mike Gibson. Mike, thanks for joining me here today on Medscape Cardiology.
Always fun to do our end-of-the-year wrap-up and look forward to next year.
Yeah, so let's think about that, Mike. We're going to talk about 2015, the cardio year in review. So, Mike, I want to maybe start with lipid therapy, move into antithrombotics, talk about heart failure and hypertension, get into valvular heart disease, and then maybe end with a whole series of what I'll call socio-cultural issues in medicine, which might include maintenance of certification, technology, and mobile health. The recent announcement at the AHA sessions on Google AHA Grand Challenge, and then maybe close up with some of the issues that you've been tweeting about a lot lately, dealing with drug pricing. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
So, Mike, let's kick it off with lipid lowering. This week we had an interesting FDA advisory panel hearing on Improve It, which was the large trial that looked at the addition of ezetimibe to simvastatin versus simvastatin alone in LDL lowering. And the sponsor had put forward an application to expand the label of ezetimibe to include the clinical outcome data. You and I are not directly involved with the trial, but certainly my former research group was, and your former research group and the TIMI study group was. So we'll be clear about that declaration. But talk to me about Improve It and ezetimibe and how the FDA advisory committee viewed it or didn't view it.
Well, you know what was fascinating, Bob, was everyone was holding their breath, waiting on the Improve It results to inform the regulatory discussion surrounding the PCSK9 inhibitors. If Improve It was positive, that would lend credence to the LDL hypothesis, namely that achieving lower LDLs yields better outcomes. And everyone, was very excited to see that there was a part of that curve that kept going down. We could get LDLs down lower and see improved outcomes. Improve It lied right on the line that all the other trials lied on, relating lower LDL to better outcomes. With that as a backdrop, the FDA did give, a level of approval to the PCSK9 inhibitors at this point, obviously not being widely used, but being used in those patients with the most pronounced forms of hyperlipidemia. And now yesterday it came time to review the Improve It study. And, I watched the entire presentation, and basically the FDA said, well, we're not going to argue about the LDL hypothesis. We're not going to argue about the approval of other drugs. But yet, throughout the meeting, a lot of that happened. At the end of the day, the 15 members of the panel said, well, you reduce the endpoint from 34.7% in the Simba group alone down to 32.7% in the combination group with ezetimibe. That just was not a robust finding to them clinically over 7 years. They also raised a lot of questions about missing data. And I would say there was almost as much time talking about the missing data as there was talking about the data that was observed. So this is a cautionary note for the future, for sponsors, that you must minimize missing data in your trials. 11% like that observed in improvement is not going to go without notice at regulatory agencies. We had 43 drugs approved in 2015, including female Viagra, but here's a trial that met its primary endpoint, did in fact reduce cardiovascular events. And again, I think many of us were frustrated that the panel didn't weigh just in on the science of the trial, its integrity. They also decided how they thought the drug should be used in practice, which should be left more to the purview of the practicing physician and perhaps CMS and payers. It seemed as though they thought they were charged with that mandate.
Yeah, it was really an interesting discussion, and I agree with you. One of the panelists made the note at the end, who actually voted in favor of approval, said, well, wait a minute. They said what they were going to do. They set out and did it. They actually showed that they accomplished a modest reduction in clinical outcomes, which was almost exactly what they had predicted based on previous knowledge of LDL lowering. They demonstrated extensive, almost 10 years worth of safety data, and yet they were really taken to task over this. And it struck me, Mike, not for the first time, that there were a lot of agendas at play with some of our colleagues on the panel.
I agree. I thought it was a sad day for cardiology. I think we aren't going to wake up one day and say, my gosh, coronary artery disease is gone. It's not going to disappear with one pharmacotherapy. We are working the edges. We're going to see modest improvements in outcomes. And if people turn their noses up at modest improvements in outcomes, we aren't going to see a path forward. So,
let's talk about then PCSK9, because it gets approved, as you've said, on the basis of LDL lowering, making the assumption that somebody thinks that LDL lowering is worthwhile for patients. And certainly no one can argue that the group of patients with familial hyperlipidemia for whom the drug is now approved stand to benefit from LDL lowering. But we're going to see what, Mike, 70, 80,000 worth of patients in clinical trials presented over the next couple of years?
That's correct. Now, I think there was the specter of higher rates of ICH raised in the combination therapy group and improvement raised yesterday. But I have to say that p-value was 0.11. It was handfuls of events. It was not statistically significant. Many people made mention of it in their assessment of the drug, but I think it was an undue concern about safety. And I also want to caution people about applying that non-significant data forward to the PCSK9 class. Obviously, as you mentioned, these are big trials. You have data safety monitoring boards looking over the ongoing evidence all the time, and obviously none of them have been stopped due to a risk of ICH. I think there was undue concern expressed about a non-significant finding that did not have any biologically plausible basis in the trial. We will see, I think, a lot of different ways to get PCSK9 levels down. One is to give antibodies. That's where we're at right now with many of the drugs. There's another drug coming along, you and I both know about very well, from the medicines company that works through RNA inhibition. And rather than mopping up the PCSK9 that's floating around in the bloodstream due to an antibody mechanism, this drug turns down the production of PCSK9. And as was presented at AHA, a 40 to 50% LDL lowering at 6 months is behaving a little bit more like a vaccine.
It may be an injection a couple of times a year is sufficient to keep your LDL down, and the question will be whether that is associated with improvement in clinical outcomes, and maybe equally important, whether or not it is sustainable from a safety perspective.
Absolutely. And obviously everyone's looking at neurocognitive deficits with formal testing. That'll be a big part of the development plan. Oral drugs are also in development, but I do think if you have an injectable drug that you give once or twice a year, that is one way to assure compliance more effectively than giving a pill.
One of the more interesting things about the approach of the IRNA drug is that you may be able to really not just give something that works, but truly have people get something that works by increasing the level of adherence. You come in quarterly or biannually for your cholesterol shot, so to speak.
Yep.
Mike, let's now think about the antithrombotic agents, an area where you and I work a lot. Some interesting developments in 2015. First off, the reversal agents for the orally active 10A inhibitors and the direct thymine inhibitors. This is a big step forward. How do you interpret this?
Well, every time you turn on the TV, you see a 1-800-BAD-DRUG commercial. I do think the reversal agents offer a seatbelt or an airbag when using these drugs. The first one out of the gate is Praxbind that works with DABI. 90 patients reported on in the New England Journal showing good PK/PD reversal of the drug and bleeding or surgery. Great start. For the factor 10A inhibitors, of course, there's Andexanet, which had its phase 3 data published in the New England Journal at AHA showing reversal of PK and PD with both Riva and apixaban. Right now, Stuart Connolly and I are leading a trial looking at the clinical outcomes of these drugs when people are bleeding. So we have a few non-specific strategies like prothrombin complex concentrates and recombinant factor 7A. They're being used some right now as almost a last-ditch effort. There's not a lot of good data, though, with factor 10A inhibitors for their use. Good data with fluorophore, but not for factor 10A inhibitors. I do think this will be a step forward for the class.
Yeah, tough to study, isn't it? I mean, we've just had a discussion about the insufficient nature of a trial that's quite large with more than 5,000 clinical events observed. And now we're talking about approval of agents on the basis of literally a handful of patients and an even smaller handful of clinical events. But there is such high emotion around the reversal agents that, in fact, there's some pressure to get these things on the market, isn't there?
Absolutely. You're seeing the accelerated pathway as a result of that pressure.
Anything else you like in the antiplatelet, anticoagulant world? I continue to be impressed with something that you and I would have found almost unthinkable a decade ago. People are willing to subtract aspirin from their antithrombotic regimen, and in fact, we're starting to study regularly antithrombotic regimens without aspirin as backbone therapy. You want to comment on that? You're involved in some of those trials.
Absolutely. You know, we went through a period in the 90s and early 2000s of adding. Now we're in a period of subtracting. And, I'm running a trial called Pioneer where we're taking away aspirin in those people who have both AFib and ACS. Keep in mind that aspirin's a pretty weak antiplatelet agent. Keep in mind that aspirin actually obviously contributes to GI bleeding by inhibiting, the protective prostaglandins. And keep in mind the results of WOOST, a trial that showed you can cut bleeding almost in half by getting rid of aspirin and replacing that with what I call a dual pathway approach of a thienopyridine plus a factor Xa inhibitor. So there are 3 trials going on: Pioneer, Redual, Augustus, all ongoing right now. I'll be reporting the results of Pioneer next year, looking at a WOOST-like strategy with Riva, an Atlas-like strategy with Riva, and traditional triple therapy in those patients with the overlap syndrome. Even in regular good old ACS patients without AFib, we're trying this strategy out in a trial called Gemini, where you pick your DAPT and then you add either aspirin versus Riva to see what's going to be most safe and effective. And then dropping aspirin from DAPT is being tested out in 2 trials. Global Leaders and Twilight are testing out ticagrelor alone versus aspirin plus ticagrelor. So the interventional world seems to be wanting to take things away and stop DAPT earlier. Of course, counter to that, we have trials this year like DAPT and Pegasus saying, continue these drugs longer. I don't think we've seen a groundswell of support for those studies, but maybe with Bobby Yee's risk score, we can figure out those people who would benefit the most from prolonged therapy.
Yeah, to me, the real issue here is your last comment, which is getting towards what I'll call the personalization of antithrombotic therapy. Is that I really have believed for a long time, Mike, that certain conditions, certain patients, certain situations make one more apt to benefit from an antiplatelet agent than an anticoagulant, and vice versa, that there are other situations where an anticoagulant might offer preferential benefit. And now what we've got to do is figure out when is it, in which group of patients, in which group of conditions, and at what time? I mean, is it in the first couple of days, the first couple of months? Can we transition people to different regimens, different doses, different strategies as we go on over time? And I think the work done by Bobby Yee and the DAPT group at trying to understand both risk of ischemia balanced against risk of bleeding are the kind of data that we're going to need to make personalized decisions along the way.
I agree completely. Sadly, though, Bob, if someone's at a greater risk of efficacy events, they're usually at a greater risk of bleeding events, and it becomes hard to tease out those patients who have efficacy without bleeding.
That's been one of the great challenges in the field of antithrombotic therapy for the few decades I've been involved with it. But I think, Mike, we're getting, more sophisticated. We're going to have better biomarkers. We're going to have better understanding of the genetic influences. We're going to be able to measure more proteins, more metabolites. My prediction is that in a couple of years, you and I will have a conversation with data to support the notion of personalization of antithrombotic therapy.
I agree. And let's not forget about STEMI and BiVal, Cangrelor, and all that's going on there. Obviously, you represented Cangrelor at the FDA, and you and I were involved in the trials. You chaired them. And, an effective drug at reducing stent thrombosis. I think it's important for everyone to remember that about 15% of patients with ACS will vomit up their thienopyridines, and we do need parenteral drugs. You can reduce stent thrombosis in MI and not have a big penalty in terms of bleeding with Cangalor. It is going to be given as foundation therapy in Horizons 2, the biggest primary PCI trial ever. That's going to be 6,840 patients. Greg Stone is chairing this. 3 pharma strategies. Obviously, there's some stent thrombosis with bivalve, and there will be a bivalve 4-hour infusion arm to see if stent thrombosis is reduced with that. There will be a bivalve with no infusion, the way most of us are using it now, and we'll see if Cangalor reduces the risk of stent thrombosis in that arm. And then there will be a heparin arm, again, given with Cangalor, and we'll see if that's the best strategy for NACE.
You're getting into personalization even with that description. We're really getting into strategies of care, aren't we?
It's good to see people from the other side of the Atlantic working with us on designing the trial and helping come up with the appropriate way to test out the best strategy.
Let's take a sprint through a few more topics, and let's start with hypertension. Sprint. I consider this one of the big pieces of news of the year. What about you?
Big news. I think there was some angst about the trial results being released in the press release before all of us seeing the absolute risk reductions at AHA, but it lived up to the promise. A reduction in mortality that was real, both in relative risk terms and absolute risk terms, biggest in heart failure patients. I think, it's not consistent with what had been seen in the past, but what had been studied in the past was this question in diabetics. These were not diabetics, and the answer in a much larger study was quite different.
It will change practice. Certainly, I already have begun having conversations with my patients about pushing their blood pressure control a little harder and recognizing you're going to take multiple drugs to do it.
Cheap drugs, too, Bob. These are cheap drugs.
Generic drugs. Generic drugs.
Right.
You made the comment about you didn't like the way that the trial was released, and I agree with that, Mike. I don't like, why did they have to have a press conference telling us how good the results were and then not provide us any data for a few more months? I just don't understand that. They should have either provided us the data when they released it, or they should have not said anything until they released it.
And then you had CNN and every other channel having on physicians saying, get your blood pressure down to 120. Turns out that's the answer, but we didn't have enough data at that time to make that recommendation.
Yeah, and I'll venture to say if that were a pharmaceutical company who had had that press release as opposed to the federal government, the press would not have been so kind to the
there would have been
press
a lawsuit
release.
over it. Absolutely.
Let's talk about, we talked a little bit about thrombosis. Let's talk about this interesting observation that's come up in the world of aortic valve replacement and the notion that on imaging studies, some of these valves might have thrombosis or at least some decreased excursion of the valve associated with implantation. What do you think about that? You think that's something we should worry about?
Well, it is an imaging finding. I think many people in the TAVR community are not that concerned about it. What I found compelling, though, was the observational data, not real randomized data, observational data showing that anticoagulation reduced this risk. And that speaks more towards causality and that this may be real. Just so the audience knows, there is a 3,000 patient trial planned now to look at the impact of rivaroxaban in reducing this problem in TAVR patients, if it exists.
Yeah, that's the question. Is it a real clinical finding or is it the result of sophisticated imaging? And, it's like a lot of
pretty
things.
Big trial to go and answer a question. We're not even sure if there's a there yet. But
yeah, no, I'm with you. But it has gotten people's attention. And I think that we're going to have to look at this carefully. And I predict a lot more information to come in 2016. A couple more topics, Mike. Maintenance of certification. Certainly you and I have been critical of the ABIM, the whole maintenance of certification process. Our friend and colleague Paul Tierstein has really done an incredible job of leading the charge, trying to get physicians mobilized to really speak up for ourselves on behalf of the profession and the notion of lifelong learning, but not necessarily done through the ABIM. You want to comment?
Yeah, we now have 3,000 MDs that are board certified through the National Board of Physicians and Surgeons. We have a growing number of hospitals that accept that board certification as the sole method of certification. ABIM did change and concede on some points. We're going to continue because we really do think it's time not just for negotiation, but for a real overhaul of the way we educate and certify physicians. The anesthesiologists are doing a good job with this. They're doing away with the secure, high-stakes 10-year exam and replacing it with what they call the MOCA Minute. You answer 120 questions per year by email or on a mobile app or a portal. It, by design, takes you a minute or two for each question. If you get it wrong, you're asked the question again later in the year to see if you've learned. So I think that's more and more going to be the future. True continuous medical education, not these kinds of every 10-year cramming medical education approaches. And I think the anesthesiologists are showing us the way.
None of us would disagree with the notion of lifelong learning. The question is, how do we do it? And let's get lifelong learning in tune with what the tools are that we have to do lifelong learning. Let's do it at the point of care. Let's do it continuously. Let's do it in a way that's consistent with how we're all getting our education throughout the year. I could not agree with you more, Mike. The way that it's being done now is really out of date and needs to change. Social media, Google, Apple, technology companies getting involved with biomedical research. What's going on, Mike? We're now looking at Google, Apple, and other tech companies being major funders of biomedical research or major collaborators in biomedical research. Is this the future?
I think so. You and I have been early to embrace social media. I look at the news every morning and I share it with my audience. We now have about 200,000 followers. I think it's a very, very fun and powerful way to learn. They are getting more and more into healthcare. Google Health didn't succeed on its first go-round, but now they are trying to do something which is much more, I'd say, dramatic and true, delving into the biology of people's genomics, and you know very well. The implantable wearable world, we'll see what happens there. The terabytes of information are being collected daily. I don't think we know how to digest all that information. I've led a trial now or trials for 15 years looking at implantable devices monitoring ST segments. We'll be presenting the results at the FDA meeting here coming up in the spring. And we'll see how the world reacts to what we're learning. But Bob, you've been very involved with Google and, the baseline study that you're working or partnering with Google on and the grant between Google and AHA. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so just great stuff, Mike. I mean, first off, on the Apple front, colleagues here at Stanford, you and Ashley, Mike McConnell, Alan Young with My Heart Counts, and being able to enroll people using the smartphone in a clinical study. Almost 100,000 people downloaded the app. More than half gave us consent to capture their data. And in a very rapid fashion, you collect data on things like physical activity. And it's mind-boggling, Mike, the potential here to really rethink how we do clinical investigation. And likewise with Google, we have a project with Stanford and Duke and our friends at Google Life Science to try to reclassify and rethink about the state of normal being physiologically and how one thinks about the progression to disease, in this case, atherosclerotic disease and cancer. So still a lot to come. And then finally, as you've indicated, this grant challenge between Google Life Science, the AHA, and putting forward $50 million, $25 million from each organization to really name a single leader to compose a team to take on the problem of coronary heart disease. I think it was an exciting piece of news in 2015. It'll be a bigger piece of news in 2016. Let's close, Mike, with something that I've been following on your Twitter account for the last few weeks, and something that affects all of us, as providers, affects our patients. The drug pricing issues that we're seeing now with some of the gouging of the public through some of these small startup companies that exist for no other purpose than to buy a cheap generic drug and then to increase the price hundreds, if not thousands of fold in order to reap an immediate quick profit and then get out of the business. It's pretty distasteful.
This isn't pharmaceutical development. This is extortion. It's essentially saying to patients, your wallet or your life. When you have life-saving therapies and are charging people their entire life savings for the drug, that is not a way to improve public health or even ensure your own company's viability. A parasite cannot kill the host. And that's what's happening with some of these smaller biotech companies.
We all understand the whole notion of certain prices that need to support innovation. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about something as pure and simple as greed, where people are jacking up a price on a generic drug that's been available, in some cases literally for decades, and trying to extort a quick profit.
Yeah, there was no development cost in the toxoplasmosis drug. This was simply a monopolistic practice that is extorting money from not just patients, but the payers as well. People act like this is a victimless crime, I'm just really sticking it to the insurance companies and charging them. We all pay for it when we have to pay our insurance premiums. So it's not a victimless crime. We want people to be incented to innovate. But that's not what we're talking about here.
We're both in favor of creativity and innovation and the investment thereof. That's not what we're talking about. It's been a great year for cardiology news in 2015. A lot coming ahead in 2016. Can I get you to do this next year as well, Mike?
Yeah, 2015 was an exciting year. I think 2016 will be just as exciting.
Thanks to you, Mike, and thanks to our listeners for tuning in to Medscape Cardiology and the year in review of 2015.